Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll just wait for a couple more participants. Claire, can I see you on the screen?
My camera is on, Andrea, so you should be able to see me.
Right. Okay, so good morning, everybody, and welcome to our weekly webinar series. My name is Andrea Davis, and I am the Programme Manager at the Civil Service College. Today we are joined by the fantastic Clair Fisher, who is our expert trainer, who will be delivering today's session on evidence-based policy making, measuring success. It is an interactive session, so please do ask lots of questions throughout. If there is any technical glitches, if you can't hear me very well, if you can't hear Claire, if there's any difficulties, please do let us know in the chat box as we go along. Okay, so our UK footprint, who are the Civil Service College? We are an independent training organisation that offers training solutions to the UK civil service and the wider public sector. We have delivered training not just to central government departments, such as the Cabinet Office, DEFRA and DWP, but also devolved administrations like the Welsh Government and of course our NHS, as well as local authorities. Not only do we work in the UK, of course we work internationally as well. As you can see here, we have got various contacts around the world, starting from the Middle East all the way to Africa and so on. So for those that have joined us today who are from other countries, welcome, hello, and please do get in touch with us if you do want any training delivered in your country. Of course we have that capacity to do so, and of course we can arrange you coming over to the UK and you taking part in your training here as well. So our course categories, we offer and deliver around 70 different types of course categories, ranging from accountability and governance to leadership and management, professional development, policy, law and legal, media, digital and data, and so on. Today's webinar will fall under the policy series. Again, Claire can offer you a lot of information on that after today's webinar. You can contact Claire or myself to find out a little bit more, so we can arrange some training based on policy for you. Our open courses, we do deliver them virtually, and we also offer them face-to-face, so you can actually access our website to see what kind of courses that we do offer. We offer tailored solutions as well. So we actually do meet the learning requirements for each individual or organisation. Wherever you're from, we can actually talk to you about meeting your learning needs. And again, as mentioned, we do work internationally as well. So that means that one of our trainers can come on, fly over to your country, or we can organise you taking a trip to London and having your training here as well. Okay, so where are we based? We are based right in the heart of Westminster, London. We are on St James's Park, which is approximately about a 10-minute walk from Parliament. We are right beside all of the tourist attractions as well, 50 minutes from Buckingham Palace, and about 5-minute, 10-minute walk into the hub of Whitehall itself. Just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, okay? So if you do have any contacts, colleagues, friends or family that would like to see this recorded, we can send it to them and send it to yourself, of course. If you do have any questions for us, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And please don't be afraid to share your comments in the chat box. We want to try and make this very engaging as possible, of course. So please do pop any questions, comments at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so as mentioned, we have Clair Fisher joining us today. Today's session will be, again, on evidence-based policy making, measuring success. which follows on from Claire's previous webinar that took place a couple of months ago, which was based on understanding the 4 critical elements of the policy process. Today's 1-hour online workshop will explore what measuring success means in practice and why it is often hard to translate this great intention into reality. Claire will also introduce a practical framework for you and link it to real-life examples for participants to learn from. So a bit about Claire. Claire's career began in civil service as a fast streamer in the Lord Chancellor's Department for Constituent Affairs, now of course called the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office and the Government Office for the South East as well. She has held senior roles and worked closely with ministers to lead complex projects during turbulent and challenging times. Claire now delivers training, consultancy and coaching across the public sector, specialising in public policy and strategic leadership skills. She has worked with many Whitehall departments and across the wider public sector in the UK and also with governments internationally. Claire is a tutor on the SOAS Public Policy and Management Master's Programme and is a fellow of both the Chartered Management Institute and the Higher Education Academy. So without further ado, Claire, please take it away.
Hello, can you hear me, Andrea? Is that okay?
Yeah, perfectly, yeah.
Yeah, great. So now I've got control of my own screen. Let's see if I can work out how you can see me, because for some reason, there we go, start the video.
Yeah. Hello.
That's better. So yes, that's me. Let's get rid of that other cheesy picture. That was when I had a pre-lockdown haircut. There we go. I need to get back to that version of me. So as Andrea said, this morning's session, we're going to be thinking about evidence-based policymaking and specifically about measuring success. So we've seen a lot of this recently. We've seen a lot of experts, particularly in the UK, and I'm sure wherever you are in the world today, there's been a resurgence of experts, hasn't there, and their kind of reliance on evidence. I'm not sure our scientific advisors thought that they would be the celebrities that they are, but we're seeing more of this, and politicians are increasingly feeling the need to show that they are relying on evidence and that their actions they are taking are evidence based. We're seeing this at the moment in the UK. There's a real debate around how are we going to open up our schools safely? What does the evidence say? Is it safe to go to pubs? Crucially, everybody's quite concerned, although less concerned once they get in the pubs is my observation. But again, we're wondering about the evidence. A big controversy: should we wear masks? Shouldn't we wear masks? How does this virus transmit itself? So the kind of coronavirus and the focus on the NHS and the medical science has really brought this question into focus in recent months. But it's not just about coronavirus. It's not just this kind of particular crisis that is where we are thinking about evidence. I've been doing a lot of work recently with departments thinking about climate change, thinking about long-term issues, big structural scientific questions about what the science says the issues are and how we respond. And then those big grand things, maybe the more local kind of reality about the obesity crisis, and again a real focus on that recently in the UK. Again, what does the evidence show us that the problem is, and what action can we take? My career was spent doing quite a lot of work on infrastructure projects, big infrastructure projects, and there we were thinking often about cost and practicality and deliverability. And so what we're seeing is over and over again in the public policy sphere, this question of evidence seems to be more relevant now than ever. So as we begin today's webinar, I'm going to talk a little bit about the why and the what of using evidence in making policy, a little bit about the how practically we do that. And as Andrea said, I'm going to try and bring out some of the issues around what makes this so difficult to do, actually, And I'm assuming most of you that have tuned in today because you're doing this for real or you have some kind of practical interest. So I will also try and make sure that we have some practical pointers as well that you can take away, things that you can look at. So later on in the slides, and you'll get the slide pack after today, there are links to some free resources, and I will talk you through the various resources and why I'm recommending them as we go. But as Andrea says, we're also more than happy to come and deliver tailored training to you or do some work with your organisation to help you work through these things. So a little bit of a refresh. First of all, the policy Venn diagram. The three critical elements, this comes from the UK Treasury. Three critical elements in policy making. We talk about politics, evidence and delivery, and how these three things fit together. And you'll be pleased to see that evidence is right there, one of the three critical things to think about in policy making. Because it's so crucial, and we'll talk as we go through this morning about why is it crucial and what we do in order to incorporate evidence into the policy making process. But I think it's right early on just to acknowledge that evidence doesn't sit alone, it sits with the delivery reality and also with the political reality, and it doesn't have a dominance over those elements, and it's not subservient to them, but it is something that should be held together very much. And what this means actually is that there's really no easy answers. Paul Kearney, who's a brilliant writer on this, an academic, and I will be recommending that you go and have a look at some of his resources as well, because he writes extensively on this, says that we need to recognise that evidence is always political. There's no such thing as pure evidence or one right answer, and specifically because the public policy that we think about is complex, this means there's never one right answer. So increasingly, particularly in the UK government, we were trying to move away from talking about evidence-based policy to the slightly more nuanced idea of evidence-informed policy, which I think captures something of this relationship between the needs to have really rigorous and robust evidence, but also the reality of the context that we work in, that it's political and that it needs to be delivered. And that's not to say that the politicians ignore the evidence, but actually the reality is the evidence is rarely simple or straightforward. It doesn't kind of often point to one simple answer. So we need a degree of sophistication in the way that we handle evidence, which is what makes it so tricky, but also so interesting. So I will try and talk about evidence-informed policymaking, because I think that's a more realistic ambition. We also we talk about evidence synthesis, this idea that there is no one piece of evidence, there is no one right answer. So what we're thinking about when we handle evidence in policy making is bringing together evidence, often competing evidence or contradictory evidence. It's been a really excellent report, again something I'd recommend you look at, by the brilliant Institute for Government, looking at policy success, and they did an analysis of successful policy. They identified that in 80% of successful policy there was a contested evidence base. So even when policy is successful, there isn't always agreement about the evidence base. And if you've been following, as I'm sure you have, the various governments' responses to the coronavirus, you will see that there is no one single bit of evidence that kind of trumps everything else. So we are in the business of evidence synthesis, putting stuff together, seeing what seems to make the most sense. And actually about trade-offs as well. Again, Bardek, who writes on policy, talks all the time about the need to trade off one benefit against another, because in policy making what we're doing is not one simple thing, it is a complex system of things. So we're always looking at how does the evidence fit together and how do we trade off one against the other. I think it's interesting for me when we talk about policy success, often the things that are easily identifiable as successes, so for example in the UK starting to charge people to use plastic bags, for example, are relatively simple and straightforward things. They're quite easy to implement, quite easy to measure, and quite easy to talk about success, because we do operate in this complex environment. So if it's so difficult, and it is, why do we bother? Why don't we just say, yes, minister, do what the politicians want, deliver something that works, and ignore that whole sphere of evidence? I think there are some really quite important reasons actually about the why evidence matters. And I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about that to kind of convince us, I hope, that the work is worth doing, and then we'll come on to the how. So for me, the why comes under kind of two categories. There's the philosophical, ethical reasons. The UK civil service values honesty, impartiality, objectivity, integrity. Wherever you are in the world, whichever system you work in, you'll probably recognise, if you're working as part of a kind of civil service type organisation, these values underpin the work that we do. And so fundamentally, we want to be honest. We want to deliver good quality work based on evidence. We want to be impartial and objective. We want to act with integrity. So there's a really practical, a really kind of almost a philosophical and ethical reason why it matters that in what we do, the evidence is right. Also, those of us maybe the more practical bent, I think it really matters that we know that what we are proposing and what we're delivering and what we are investing our time in working on, we want to know that it works. We want to know that it works efficiently. We want to know that it delivers value for whoever's paying for it, the taxpayer normally, that it's effective, that if you're investing your time into something, you want to know that it is effective at delivering its objective. And also in the public sector, we want to have a sense that there's a fairness about what we're doing, that people for whom the policies are designed are benefiting in the way that it was intended. So for me, there's quite a compelling argument, although it's difficult to do well, perhaps because some of the political things kind of get in the way a little bit sometimes. It does still matter that we take the way that we handle evidence seriously. So I want to kind of introduce you to a couple of frameworks, a couple of ways of thinking about things. And again, these are the kind of things that in our training courses we could unpick with you in more detail, and we could help apply these to the policies and the situations that you're working in. But again, lots of resources I'm going to point you to so you can have a look at to follow up for yourself. Before we do that, I think we need just to be really clear about these two questions. And I think I did touch on this a little bit in the previous webinar on the policy cycles, but worth just coming back to those. For me, whatever the models that we use, whatever the kind of highly complicated and sophisticated work that we hopefully will get into around evidence, we need to remember that fundamentally we are trying to answer these two key questions. So the two key questions for me: is the problem that we think is the problem actually the problem? So in policy making, it's very easy to make assumptions about a problem, particularly when a politician has kind of jumped on a bandwagon. And very often we'll hear, I worked as a private secretary to several government ministers. They will come in and they'll say, the problem is, and they'll make a grand statement. The problem is that children spend too much time on computer games. The problem is that all these young people are going out and getting drunk and not wearing their masks. The problem is, and actually, if we don't intervene at that point, if we don't intervene to understand whether the problem that we think is the problem is actually the problem, we can invest a whole lot of energy trying to fix something, the wrong problem. So a lot of our evidence, a lot of our research needs to go in fairly early on to establish what actually is the problem. And it flows from that fairly obviously whether the solution that we think is the solution is actually the solution. Is the thing that we think will fix this problem actually the thing that will fix this problem? Is the sugar tax actually going to make children thinner? Is paying 5p for a plastic bag actually going to reduce the amount of plastic that we make? We can have ideas about what might fix a problem, but if we don't have evidence to test those assumptions, then we don't know whether the policy will work. And those two fundamental questions come before any kind of evaluation, and we'll move on to talk about evaluation later on. But often when we think about evidence and policy making, we're thinking about that evaluation phase. But these two questions are the questions we ask earlier on in the policy cycle. Do we understand the nature of the problem, and are we clear about the nature of the solution? I think also in policy making, we think that we are thinking of something new when maybe somebody's done work on this before. So also a big part of our evidence and our use of evidence should be properly understanding what's happened before and what we already know. So there's some kind of big ideas, some stuff around why evidence matters, the kind of questions that we might be looking to answer with evidence in the early stages of the policy cycle. And like I said, I want to just introduce you to a few frameworks that hopefully will help you think about how you organise and search for information. This 6-step process is one that's recommended by the What Works network, and I will talk to you more about those in a few minutes. But for now, these are the things that they recommend that you cover. And when you're thinking about measuring success, these 6 steps really steer you in the right direction. Some good questions to be asking yourself when you're thinking about policy and using evidence in policy. Fundamentally, do we know what it is we want to achieve? And if the answer is just we're doing what we're told by some minister, or we're kind of reacting to some kind of popular pressure, then maybe we need to dig a little bit deeper and actually understanding what it is we want to achieve. We want to notice whether we've changed anything. So Sean Lusk talks about public policy being the act of changing the future, which makes it sound quite grand and exciting. But in order to be able to do that, we need to have a clear idea about what now looks like. Do we have baseline data? And do we have a way of measuring the change from wherever it was that we started to where we get to? And the process and the system for measuring that is really important. Also really important, do we actually have evidence to show that the thing that we're doing, our intervention, is what's causing this change that we observe? And this is where it gets really interesting and actually quite tricky in terms of public policy measuring. One of the difficulties is not really being able to show that always, and some of the weaknesses in some of the methodology when you apply them to public policy. But it's a good question to ask. How can we be sure that what we are doing is causing the change that we are seeing? And then that change, once it's happened, does it actually have an impact that can be repeated? Is it a kind of a sustainable and demonstrable effect that gets repeated over time? So, for example, the painted chevrons on the motorway, there's quite a lot of evidence that they make a huge impact, that they slow the traffic down. However, once people get used to them, they have less effect. So their effect over time is not necessarily repeatable. But we want to understand that if we're investing in a policy change, does it have an impact over time? And then it might be something that's entirely possible on a small scale to do well. But in order to have kind of transferable value, we want to understand, is this intervention something that can be scaled up? And can it be used by others with the same outcome? And this is something that time and time again in my own civil service career we realised was the real tricky one. So we did quite a lot of work with job centres and with local job centres, and trying to roll out interventions to reduce joblessness or increase access to work. And what we actually found was that it was the personality often of the job centre manager or the people doing the training that was the key thing rather than the intervention. So when you tried to roll it out or scale it up, unless you could clone the person that had made it work in the first case study, you didn't often see the results being replicated in other places. So this question about scaling and transferability, again, really interesting and important. And also we want to make sure that as we measure, as we collect evidence for our own benefit, do we allow others to learn from what we are doing? So these are kind of 6 key principles, key steps that you could use to think about measuring success, questions that you might want to ask yourself. It doesn't layer exactly, but it does fit fairly neatly with the Treasury model. And I think particularly as we are based often in the UK, and I know that the UK systems are transferred across the world, I just wanted to remind you, again, this was covered in our policy cycles webinar. We talked about the policy cycle, going from the rationale of thinking about the good idea, designing the outcomes, to appraising, implementing, measuring and evaluating. And just to say really that you can see when you look at this cycle that evidence should be playing a critical role at every part in this process. So the outcome, the question there about do we understand the problem, evidence to be there. In the appraising of the options, are we basing that appraisal on evidence? What are we measuring as we implement, and how do we evaluate? And the Treasury's Green Book is really clear that good evaluation is actually about putting things in place really early on in the process. So it's about how you're defining your outcomes, how you then measure the delivery of those outcomes through the system, and that being the basis for your evaluation. So again, like I said, one of the things that often goes wrong is we think that evidence is really only an evaluation issue, but really we should be thinking about it throughout the policy process. For some of you, particularly any of you from the kind of academic side, may be familiar with a model that looks a bit more like this, something that looks a bit more like program theory. As Andrea mentioned, I am an academic on this subject. I teach on the SOAS Public Policy Masters and on other Public Policy Masters programs as well. And the academic world is full of models that look a bit like this, really quite intricate and elaborate program theory models. You don't actually often see much of this translated into the real world, in my experience, but nevertheless, I would suggest that there is a good availability of resources that you could have a look at. And this is really to do with establishing, before you deliver your policy, what you are expecting to happen. What are you how is your intervention supposed to work? What's your hypothesis, if you like, before you begin about how your intervention will change something, and then measuring it? And this scientific, if you like, approach to policy work is quite attractive. It's very good in academic terms, but doesn't often survive contact with the real world, in my experience, because the real world is often more iterative, more about culture, more about organizational change, more about moving at speed, more about testing and learning and adapting, more about the kind of storytelling and the softer skills of trying to get people to change behavior. Nevertheless, there is quite a lot of stuff, particularly if you are doing contracted work in the public sector. I would suggest you have a look at the Outcomes Lab. They've done quite a lot of work on public impact bonds, and they have quite a lot of good resources to do with how can you track your program theory interventions. So different ways of thinking about how we do the same thing, but essentially it's about being clear what it is you're trying to achieve, how you're going to measure that, measuring it as you do it, and then reviewing it after it's happened. And although evidence isn't just about evaluation, it also should be a key feature of evaluation. And when we start to think about the contextual constraints of evaluation, we start to realize why getting this stuff right is so tricky, particularly in public policy, because the places that we deliver policy in are not the same. It's not like a scientific method with 8 sterile Petri dishes. If we are implementing a policy in 8 different places, we will have 8 different sets of outcomes. The macroeconomic factors are huge and overwhelming, and anybody designing public policy right now will be overwhelmed by the macroeconomic factors. It would be hard to imagine a policy right now that wouldn't be impacted by what's going on in our economy. And also, public policy is always about people, and people are not rational, they're not petri dishes. We can't replicate behaviour always, so we need to consider the social aspects of the policy. We've talked a little bit about political. There's the small p political, the difficulties between different groups and organisations, but also very often governments change, and so we can't always deliver the kind of long-term programmes that we want to, and that impacts timing. And our institutions, the culture and the structures and the history of our institutions often get in the way. And particularly in the UK, when we think about the NHS, the kind of the changes in the NHS and the fragmentation in the NHS mean replicating, measuring, predicting how things might play out are really, really complex questions. So those are things to consider when we think about evaluation. And maybe some lessons about what most often goes wrong. So a colleague of mine from SOAS, John Bell, has identified these 4 things that go wrong most often in evaluation. So these are the kind of pitfalls to avoid, I suppose, when we're thinking about using evidence, particularly in evaluation. Lack of baseline information. We don't measure before we begin, so we don't know what we're aiming for or where we're starting from. Limited resources. So evaluation often feels like a luxury that we can't afford. We kind of just plod on delivering what we think is working without really being sure about it. Or evaluation or evidence gathering is an add-on that happens kind of post hoc after the event. So we're not really sure what we were trying to achieve or what we're measuring. We kind of have to tack it on, and this makes it really, really hard to do well. And those that are working in a political environment, I will imagine, will recognise this as well. Your goals change part the way through the delivery. What we're trying to achieve changes because of a change of administration or a change of minister, or because somebody in the system changing their mind. So these are all the kind of issues swirling around within the context of us trying our best to use evidence well. So in the kind of second half of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about how we do this. I'm going to talk about the work of the What Works centres, and I'm going to just signpost you to what I think are some really excellent resources. So I would just remind you that if you do have questions, you can pop those in the Q&A box. Yep. And Andrea,
please feel free at any point to make any comments, or if there's anything that Claire mentions or perhaps anything that doesn't really make sense, then please feel free to ask throughout. That's absolutely fine.
Great. So there will be a specific time for Q&A at the end, and we'll pick up the Q&A at the end. I'll make sure I leave space for that. But kind of in the midway point, I'll just pause and just say if there's anything particular that we've already said kind of about the theory before we get into the practical stuff, do just pop those into the chat. I can see them and I'll be able to pick them up a little bit as we go in this next session. So I want to do a mighty plug for the What Works network. I do a lot of training. I do a lot of work with organisations. I train specifically on this use of evidence and research. Specifically with the Civil Service College, we've been working a lot recently with the Greater London, with the London Assembly, with the Office of the London Mayor, the GLA, on research skills. And I am always amazed how few people working in public policy in the UK know about the What Works network. So I want to do a mighty plug because they are brilliant, and just knowing they exist will help you no end if this is new information to you. I should declare an interest. I am an associate of the What Works network. I genuinely am in love with them, and they haven't paid me specifically to tell you how brilliant they are, but they really, really are very, very good. So they come from this kind of radical thought. They've been around about 10 years now, the What Works network. They came in with the coalition government in the UK in 2010. They were sort of the brainchild of David Cameron. They come from this radical idea that every pound of taxpayers' money should make a meaningful difference in people's everyday lives. They come from a radical idea that when we spend taxpayers' money, we should spend it on what works. Clue is in the title. And they invest their time and their energy working out what is it that works. How do we get good at measuring what works in public policy, and how can they help inform those that work in the public policy space about what works? So there's a network of these centres, and they cover various policy issues. So there we are. That's the kind of graphic from their review. Again, just Google the What Works network. You can find the blog, and it will take you through to all the various centres. So you'll see that there's What Works centres that consider early education. Many of you in the UK will be most familiar with the work of NICE, the National Institute for Healthcare Excellence, and this concept that you can't get a prescription for a medicine that NICE haven't approved. You can't spend taxpayers' money on a medicine that we don't know whether it works for the condition that you've got. And underlying the What Works network is this idea that if we can do it for medicine, why can't we do it for all policy interventions? Why would we spend money on education or policing or social work or economic improvement work if we're not sure that the money that we're spending actually works in the way that we expect it to? So this kind of rigor in the way that we evaluate and prioritise our spending on public sector improvement has been driven over the last decade in the UK, particularly by this network. And each network is organised independently. Each network has a website, and each network has resources that are available. They act as hubs, really. So if you see something on the screen that chimes with the policy area that you work in, do look them up, find out what they've got, sign up to their mailing list, and you will find lots and lots of useful information there. By way of example, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. So that's the centre that I am an associate of. And just by way of kind of advertising to what they do and what's available, because this is a critical part of how the UK government has been handling evidence recently. And so the centres, they collate existing evidence. So the issue with the use of evidence is not a supply one, actually. There is a lot of evidence out there, and often the issue is finding your way, navigating your way through it. So the centres collate the existing evidence, and they produce these really high quality synthesis of reports and systematic reviews. So you can read one of their reviews on something. So for example, today the What Works Centre for Wellbeing have published a piece of work looking at the impact of lockdown on children's mental well-being. It took me 5 minutes to read it, and really high quality stuff. Whereas doing that research myself probably would have taken me ages, and I wouldn't have quite got to the same place. So they produce a synthesis. They commission new work to fill the gaps. So they direct government funding into research, into new and interesting things. And then they share the findings in an accessible way. And again, so important, so much of the academic research, sadly, is behind paywalls. All the stuff that the What Works centres do is freely available, which is why I'm plugging them today, because you don't have to pay them to access their information. And it's all designed, again, not to perpetuate the kind of economic and the academic system necessarily, but to support policymakers. So to support people like you in the work that you do, lots of great information available. So for example, each centre has an evidence bank. So this is the very practical, how do you do this, where do you go if you want evidence? This is a screenshot from the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. You can go onto their websites, you can find the evidence banks, and you can see they categorise it in terms of the strength of the evidence or how their approach works. Really, really great stuff. You can, and all the different centres have equivalent banks of information. So a very easy, quick win, hopefully find the one that works for you. They also produce evidence reviews. but also they want to know from you. So if you are working in a policy field, you can contribute to the evidence base in your field by hooking in to the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. So for example, the Wellbeing Centre at the moment is looking for information on how people are coping with lockdown in the coronavirus situation. So this is a crowdsourced document. Again, you can kind of input your own research, and they can help you, and there's lots of templates in terms of how do you collect information about your own policy in a way that will contribute to the weight of policy evidence in an area. So hopefully a useful free resource for you there, and something that you will find useful. Because what I've noticed more than anything in the work that I've done around using evidence is that using evidence well actually more often than not is about building relationships with experts. You might think that what you're doing is reading a piece of research, but actually to use evidence well in policy making is about building relationships with people, with the scientists and the researchers and the statisticians and the economists or the lawyers, these experts, and how we build relationships with these people and how we bring these people together is a real key skill in policy. We talk often about policy facilitation. And a lot of the skills that we teach in the Civil Service College are these skills. So it's, you know, you can go onto the What Works Centre, you can get all the information, you can download pages and pages of stuff, but what you actually then do with it, how you communicate that, how you integrate that into the work that you're doing, it's about building the skills of communication and interpretation, briefing, how do we get the information out of the experts into the mind of the politician. These are skills that you need to learn and that you need to practice, and that we'd be delighted to help you develop. So working with the people, bringing the people together is really what's the critical thing about evidence. So I just want to kind of, in the last couple of minutes, draw to a close before we hopefully take a few questions, thinking about what do we do well? Maybe some barriers to good evidence in policy, and a little bit of a forward look, and then I will just mention some of the more resources that I promised you, and then we'll take a few questions. I think in the UK, and I realise not everybody this morning on this call might be from the UK, but I think actually the UK has a lot to be proud of in terms of the quality of the research that we do. We have really high quality expert advice. This picture is from a report from the UK Space Agency. I've done some work with them, training with, you know, more PhDs in a room than I've ever been with anywhere else, and just incredible intelligence and quality of work. And we have our experts within our government structure. We have the Government Scientific Service. You know, we have lots of really clever people within the government structure, and many, many excellent government frameworks, like the Treasury guidance that I will be referring you to in a moment. Lots of government frameworks and government guidance about how to do this stuff really well. So we do some of this stuff well. But there are barriers to evidence being used well in policy. I said, for me, one of the biggest issues is the translation issue between the experts and the policy and the politicians. We call this briefing in the civil service. This is something that's really hard to do well, which is why we invest so much in training people how to do this. It's easy. You know, you might be able to write a thesis on your subject, but can you explain it to a minister in 2 minutes in a lift? It's a very different skill, and that's one of the skills that we work a lot on at the Civil Service College. There's a demand to deliver the stuff well at speed, and again, the time pressure is what often causes the wheels to fall off this stuff working well. There are institutional barriers often to the need to collaborate, and I see it all the time. There's a gap between the kind of academic world and Whitehall, and working to bridge that gap is something of a personal mission for me, but something actually we need to get better as a system if we're going to get better at using evidence in policy making. And we're really, really good at producing these documents and these reviews and this guidance and this framework, but we don't always use them. And often that's simply because the people working don't know about them. So looking ahead, I think the government just this week, the UK government just this week has announced an increased focus on funding research and development. They've got a consultation open you can have a look at to see where they should be focusing research money. But we are, just because we've been throwing lots of money at stuff recently, I think there doesn't mean that there's a bottomless pit of cash. So I think we will continue to see this increasing demand that the money that is being spent works. And any projects that want government money will have to get better at demonstrating their impacts. I think medical science in particular is going to be under particular demand, and policymakers understanding how to work with those experts will become a really critical skill, and the relationship and the trust perhaps between the public, the government and those experts, I think is changing, and like those medical experts in that first slide, I think the experts are going to have to get a little bit more used to stepping into the limelight. And this question about complexity, the fact that there's no easy answers, the fact that everything is connected in public policy, I think people are starting to realise that, and maybe there'll be an increased willingness to grapple with some of these more difficult questions about how we use evidence in policy presentation. So you've got a kind of 30-second warning to put some more questions in, and Andrea will start to pick those out. When you get the slides, you'll see I just included a separate slide, some of the things I mentioned in passing. There's a lot of stuff on the Treasury website, the UK Treasury website, specifically the Green Book looks at how you handle evidence in policy appraisal, and the Magenta Book is specifically about how you handle evidence in evaluation. There has been a really recent update, just March this year, looking at how you deal with complexity in public policy. So if that sounds like it's your thing, have a look. That's all available on the UK Treasury website. I'd also highly recommend this. This is about measuring social impact. So this is from a Volunteering Matters organisation called Measuring the Good. It's a free resource from their website. And the Institute for Government produces brilliant things. They have a report on evidence and evaluation in policy making that I'd highly recommend, and they also have produced a brilliant report about successful policy making and what successful policy making looks like. And finally, the Centre for Public Impact, again, has a really interesting framework for measuring the impact of public policy, and again, all the resources are freely available on their website. So there's some things if you want to get stuck in and do this, and again, when you get the slides, you'll get all the links to all those places as well. And if you want help applying any of that or designing something particular for your organisation, we'd be delighted to hear from you. So any questions, Andrea? What questions do we have that I can pick up on?
So thank you for delivering that session, Claire. That was fantastic. You can now have a sip of water and take a minute breather there. And again, thank you so much for the recommendations as well. Just to remind participants, this is your time now to ask any questions that you may have. Again, if you can't think of anything now, please feel free to get in touch with us at the end of the session. Get in touch via email to me or Claire, and we will offer you as much information as possible. Claire, obviously you deliver a lot of policy-based training for the college. So I don't know if you want to, while we wait for questions, kind of talk to participants about the training that you do for us, and the training that you've delivered before, and what kind of information, because I know this is a very condensed version of what you can offer.
I think that the main thing that I'd say is that what we deliver at the college is really that overlap between training and consultancy. So what you've got today is just a kind of brain download, but what we do in real life is always apply it to people's real situations. So wherever there's a framework or a tool, we would be working in a kind of workshop situation with delegates to deliver that. So we don't just talk about policy, we develop policy. We wouldn't just teach you how to do a communications plan, we would develop a communication plan. We would help you practice doing the communication, writing the press releases. We would do role plays about how you might talk to ministers about that. So it's always very, very practical, very, very applied. And even on our open courses, we work kind of on real live case studies based on people's experiences. So it's always about how do we make this stuff work in the real world, and giving people the space to practice that, and making sure that what we are delivering isn't kind of just what's been prepared on a slide, but you know, we always start with the why are you here, what do you want to get out of today. We do pre-learning questionnaires, and me and all the trainers have loads more resources than you could ever fit into an hour or a day. So every day, every hour that we're training, we're picking the kind of perfect things that we hope will meet the needs of the individuals. So it's a very kind of interactive, very active. I talk about it being kind of coaching like actually our sessions, and we're learning. I think we're doing pretty well now at making that kind of experience work online as well. So I do some of the policy courses for the college, and I also do the introduction to management for the public sector managers, and we run really small, the online courses are really small, kind of 6 to 10 people. And we're managing now, we've all got the hang of the tech to kind of deliver that kind of experience online as well. So
fantastic, thank you. I don't know if you could just kindly move on to the next slide, Claire, because I know that you've got you've got control. Thank you very much. Now, Claire, you've delivered a session for us before, and thank you again for delivering today's, and I hope again that you'll get back on board with us again in the future. Now, please, just for participants, if you are interested in finding out more about the webinars that we do run, please do sign up to our training alerts at www.civilservicecollege.org.uk. And again, please feel free, after the session, if you do have any questions for Claire or myself that I can pass on to her, to be more than obviously happy to answer those for you. And again, Claire, if you could just kindly move on to the next one. Fantastic, yeah. Wonderful, thank you. And it's a funny old, you just click again, brilliant, okay. Ooh. And if you could also stay connected with the Civil Service College, we have a very close relationship with Claire. Please, this is our social media handle, which is at college.org, and we are on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. This recording will go on YouTube, and we will send it out to all participants as well, along with all of the resources for you. We do have Claire on LinkedIn as well, so again, if you want to contact myself or Claire on there regarding any of the information that has been delivered to you today, that is absolutely fine. Just to reiterate that we do run these webinars every single Thursday. Next week we've got a gentleman called Matt Greeno who will be delivering a session on the Leadership Management series, and that will be on speeches in a crisis. What can we learn? So if you are interested, please do sign up to our webinar webpage on our website. So Claire, thank you so much for your time. That was fantastic, and we hope that you do get back on board with us again. And to all our participants, thank you so much for joining, and we hope to be in touch very soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.